I want to ask a couple questions in just exactly this vein with regards to the potential. And I recognize, Mr. Thompson, the effort that ORMAT made some years ago at Mount Spur. I know that you have had folks within your company that continue to look at Alaska. I'm curious to know from you, Mr. Latimer, with your very impressive story about how you got into geothermal in the first place, what it would take for a company like yours to consider the opportunities for Alaska. And Mr. Spisak, we haven't brought you into the conversation a lot today, but in my state, it's my understanding that with the potential that we have in the state, BLM has areas that they too could prove to be highly potential with regards to the resource. So what is BLM doing to accelerate the opportunity for potential geothermal opportunities within the state of Alaska? So I throw it out to all of you for a little bit of discussion about what would it take to come back and look at the production possibilities in terms of bringing more geothermal into the market. And you all can jump in here because you've all got your question here.
Chairman, if I can maybe just set the stage, from our experience, a couple of ideas. One, you know, in places that geothermal is very difficult to develop, you know, the prices go up very quickly. And so our experience with Mount Spur was quite unique in the fact that it was across the Cook Inlet. There weren't very good roads. We had to build ice roads to get drill rigs there. We had a very consolidated drilling season. That project, you know, from the big scheme of things, was quite complicated. We invested about $10 million to procure the land and do the initial drilling of that project with zero federal help. We did receive some money from the state of Alaska to do that, and then had to make the tough decision. So going back to, you know, what really put ORMAT on the map in the 80s was, you know, a DOE cost share program. When they look at states with great geothermal potential, but that are very difficult to develop projects in, maybe due to a short drilling season or due to having to construct roads and things that can be very costly, that, you know, geothermal developers from Nevada are kind of, you know, triaging the first time, that would be hugely helpful. The other one, I think, is transmission. And I mentioned it earlier that transmission and interconnection is a huge issue, and not just in Alaska or Hawaii, but in the U.S. with the kind of antiquated transmission system. When we build these power plants, the geothermal resource is where it is, and we have to get that transmission, you know, that power to the transmission system. We can build the distribution lines, but interconnecting to transmission is becoming an issue. We're getting 5 to 7 year delays, and when we look at places like Hawaii, we would absolutely love to move power from the Big Island of Hawaii to the other islands. And, you know, maybe looking forward, and if I come back to this committee in another decade, what we should be looking at now is how do we move that power, and are undersea cables and so forth a reality? What are the costs of those today? And if those can move power, it unleashes the geothermal potential. We looked at other resources in Alaska along the Aleutian Island chain, and they're phenomenal resources. They just don't have a market nearby. They have a fishing market that's maybe there for a couple months, but for a private sector company to, you know, look at a payback of 60 years is untenable. So how do we connect those resources to the rail belt? And transmission and infrastructure is going to be a huge part of that as we look to the next, as we look forward. I think many companies would go back and look at Alaska, you know, if they could share some of those costs and burdens, or get some innovative help from the Department of Energy. And, you know, that's my quick and dirty pitch for
I hope your
giving
pitch
them more
doesn't
funding to do that.
discourage Mr. Latimer. What would it take?
Yes, thank you for the question, Senator. I think Alaska is a fantastic market for geothermal, and we've talked at length about the Chena Hot Springs, and that's just a great example. It's highly efficient because the ambient temperatures are cooler. It's the same reason it works so well in Iceland, and there's all kinds of additional benefits from the heat resource. The biggest constraint I see on Alaska is the lack of data. We spoke earlier about the public data sets of bottom hole temperatures and how that informs. It's a low-cost way to really narrow down your resources. And when you think about where it's difficult to do private capital on projects, it's the gap between that low-cost data and when you have a confirmed project, because doing surface studies and your confirmation drilling is extremely costly and challenging to do if you don't have confidence of some publicly available data to lower the cost of the early studies. Examples of places that have done a great job of spurring an industry in light of low data, I think one of the best success cases, you could say, from a policy and innovation standpoint would be Kenya over the last decade. So Kenya is at a point now where 50% of their electricity comes from geothermal energy, and it's increased by a factor of 10 since they passed the new Reform Act in 2007. And they did many things there, but one of the most interesting one was they worked with KfW, the Development Bank of Germany, to install a facility they called the East African Risk Mitigation Facility, where private partners can apply and get competitively accepted for matching funds for that pre-exploration, exploration, and confirmation drilling work, which really cuts down on the risk at the point where private capital is the hardest to do. So imagining looking at the success of how that instrument kickstarted the industry in Kenya, I think there's many geographies in the United States that could benefit from a similar type structure to attack the highest risk part of the project. Thank you.
And
Ms. Bezek, what's BLM doing to help facilitate, whether it's on the mapping side or just, we've heard the issues with the permitting and how that adds to the cost, the fact that it's 6 to 10 years on public lands to advance a project. I mean, that does nothing to enhance the interest from an investor's perspective.
No, I appreciate the question, Senator. Basically, we react to interest by industry and where they put in expressions of interest, and then we process those through sale. In Alaska, as has been mentioned, we have not gotten any expressions of interest to the point where we would go through the NEPA analysis and identify and put parcels up for sale like we've done in California and Nevada.
Do you think, though, that the fact that you have to go through, what did you say, 6 different NEPA steps there, do you think that that discourages just from the get-go anybody looking to a prospect that might be on public lands?
Certainly, the discussion here would convey that, and I don't doubt that at all. We're looking at, and with this report, we've reviewed it, and the GEO report that's been discussed about streamlining that NEPA Secretary Order 3355, which came out here this last year regarding NEPA analysis. So we're implementing, and that's improving the NEPA process for energy projects, including geothermal.
So yeah, I think we've heard a clear message here that there can be much that can be taken or learned from what has happened within the oil and gas industry and how we can use some of those lessons learned to either help facilitate a better process or the technologies themselves. Ms. Young, you had called for a dedicated geothermal team at BLM. And I think maybe it's ideas like that that can help us focus on this as an opportunity. What do you think about that as a suggestion? Is there anything else that BLM might be able to do to improve the processing time for the geothermal leasing?
Yeah, certainly. As you've mentioned, we've experienced different teams on the oil and gas side, and have lessons learned in that. As geothermal ramps up, we would very likely look at pulling people together to focus on that, Tiger team or Strike team, what have you, as expressions of interest come to us for processing.
And then my last question, and if Senator Ruano has additional, we'll turn to her. But we've heard from you all that there is a hurdle there when it comes to the permitting and the time that is required, the development timelines here in the United States on our public lands. ORMAT operates a lot of facilities around the world. How does the timeline say, for instance, you got a project in the Philippines. How does that compare to what we see here? And what can we be learning from how they're operating in other nations? You mentioned also Kenya. Share with me a little bit of the international perspective versus where we are in the United States.
Thank you, Chairman. To boil it down, in other countries, we do not have to go through the rigorous permitting for exploration. We typically get a tender for an area that's been designated to look at for geothermal development. We can then go do, this resource confirmation incredibly quickly, refine and define where the resource is, and then proceed with the permitting once we are ready to, build a facility and move forward. And so that is the single biggest difference in the United States and in the rest of the world, is that exploration delay requiring an EA, simply put.
Easy as that, okay.